Good day. Today is Friday, 10th January, and it's now clear that we are heading, soon after the new president is inaugurated on the 20th of January, we're heading towards a Trump-Putin summit. Donald Trump has said as much over the course of what looks like another press conference. He's quoted as saying, and this is on Fox, I'm taking this, I believe it comes from Fox News. The question was, you've been contacted by world leaders, but we still haven't gotten a call from Putin. Is it going to be next week or the week after? And then Trump is quoted as replying, a call, he wants to meet and we will arrange it. We have had many conversations with President Xi, that's the Chinese leader. We have a lot of meetings scheduled with different people. Some have already arrived, but I would prefer to wait until the 20th. The implication being that he wants to wait until the 20th of January before steps are taken to sort out a meeting with Putin. And then the questioner came back, when you say you want to meet with Putin or Xi, do you want to hold a summit or will they come here? And then Trump responded, it hasn't been decided yet, but President Putin wants to meet. He has said that publicly. We need to settle this. It is a mess. And he's absolutely right. The Russians have indeed made it clear that they are prepared for a summit, and I'm sure there's been also private confirmation of this in the various calls that have taken place between Putin and the Hungarian and Slovak Prime Ministers Orbán and Fico. And in fact, earlier today, we've also had statements from the Russians themselves about possible work being done shortly to set up a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Now, I'm taking this now from the Russian TASS news agency, and it quotes Peskov, the press spokesman, Putin's spokesman, is saying that apparently there will be some movements in this direction, that's towards a summit, after Trump enters the Oval Office. And he's then quoted as saying, there are still no specifics. We proceed from the mutual readiness for such meetings. And, well, we'll see what happens. But my guess is that directly after the Trump is inaugurated on the 20th of January, official contacts between the Russian and American governments will begin. The first real contacts that there have been since February 2022, and then shortly after there will be a proper meeting will be arranged between Putin and Trump, and we'll get some information about the date and the venue, and that, of course, will be a crucial meeting as well. Now, I've seen some suggestions that Trump is also floating the possibility of a three-party great power summit meeting between himself, Putin, and Xi Jinping, all three of them meeting together. Now, I haven't seen any confirmation of this in any reliable, what I would consider fully reliable news site, but this is a dynamic media story. It could be that Trump has indeed said something along these lines, but I haven't seen that yet. I should say that if we do have that kind of a great power summit meeting, Trump, Putin, and Xi also meeting together, well, that takes us all back to the topic of my last two programs, the discussion about great powers, return to great power diplomacy, the discussions about spheres of influence, that sort of thing. It would indeed be a step towards telling the world which are the great powers, America, Russia, and China, and the three great powers coming together, having a meeting with each other, and, well, as some will no doubt say, carving up the world between them. I'm sure it will not be that, actually, but some discussion about spheres of influence and limits on territory and whatever, that might indeed be discussed at a summit of that kind. But we mustn't go ahead of ourselves. I'm not actually sure yet that a meeting of that kind is indeed in the works. But I did mention in my program yesterday that Putin himself is talking about the fact that he's going to be speaking to Xi Jinping over the next couple of days. And, well, all sorts of things finally are in play. Now, it's important to stress what a change this makes. We have been through an extraordinary period over the last 3 years, anyway, since the start of the special military operation in February 2022. After the special military operation began, contacts at a high level between the American and Russian governments basically stopped. I mean, they stopped almost completely, to an extent that one had not seen since before the Second World War. I mean, even during the coldest periods of the Cold War, there had continued to be some level of contact between the American and Russian governments. But since February 2022, those contacts have basically reduced to a trickle. The heads of the militaries, General Gerasimov and General Milley, and then General Gerasimov and General Brown, have had a couple of telephone conversations. The defense ministers, Shoigu and Austin, have had, from my recollection, one telephone conversation. The conversation in which Shoigu telephoned Austin, this was in the autumn of 2022, told Austin that the Ukrainians were moving towards developing a dirty bomb, and the Americans subsequently put out stories that, on the contrary, it had been the Russians at around that time who had been busy planning or thinking or debating with themselves following the autumn counteroffensives by Ukraine, the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. It had been the Russians at that time who had been considering using tactical nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine, and that it had been the Americans who had been sending all sorts of warnings to the Russians at that time. And then there was a meeting also in the autumn of 2022 in Ankara between Bill Burns, the CIA director, and the head of the SVR, Sergei Narishkin. And there was, to my recollection, one meeting at some summit, or rather between Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov has given accounts of that meeting. Apparently, it didn't last very long, a few minutes, and nothing of any great substance was discussed over the course of it. And at the level of presidents, Biden and Putin, there have been no contacts or discussions at all. None. Now, as for the Europeans, well, there was a flurry of contacts directly after the special military operation began. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the French president, Emmanuel Macron, both called Putin, and there were some rather fraught conversations. The readouts are there, published by the foreign ministries and on the Kremlin's website. The meetings didn't go very well. The conversations didn't go very well. There was also a trip to Moscow a few weeks later by the Austrian Chancellor, which also didn't produce anything very much. And until a few weeks ago, that basically was it. Then some weeks ago, Olaf Scholz finally got round to speaking to Putin. Again, a conversation which doesn't seem to have led to anything very substantive. And as for the Americans, well, they have continued their practice of ignoring or rejecting any kind of dialogue with the Russians at all. One has heard all kinds of astonishing stories, and these apparently are true. Situations where Russian officials, senior Russian officials, turn up at international meetings. Lavrov has discussed this several times, and the Western representatives ignore them. They try and shuffle away whenever Lavrov or whoever is coming from Russia appears, as if Lavrov was infected with the plague or something of that kind. So there's been no discussion, no contact at all, even as the situation between America and Russia and between the West and Russia has gone from bad to worse. And of course, if we're talking about the European Commission and NATO, even as these two bodies step up their support for Ukraine and take various actions in the war, well, on their part, there's been no contact with the Russians from them either. It has been an astonishing story. And I'm going to suggest that it is compatible with this very strange situation that has existed over the last 3 years. Because throughout the entire period of the special military operation, the Western powers have behaved as if they are at war with Russia, whilst denying that they are. It's been really most odd. So they've obviously been sending a massive amount of military and economic support to Ukraine. They have also sent their personnel to Ukraine. They pretended in many cases that these people are mercenaries, but certainly in the case of some NATO countries, Poland, for example, it's fairly clear and widely understood that in many cases these were actually not just mercenaries, not really mercenaries, but actually members of the Polish armed forces. I've heard many stories that the British SAS and other military units of the British military have been involved in various activities in Ukraine. I've even heard stories that there was a shootout between British SAS troops and the Russian paratroopers at Gostomel Airport right at the start of the special military operation. Whether that is true or not, I do not know. I've just heard that story. But certainly the British have been there. The French have been there as well. As Stephen Bryan correctly said in Asia Times, the French Foreign Legion has undoubtedly been present in various military activities on Ukrainian territory, though their presence has never been formally and officially confirmed. So it's a covert conflict. The Russians, had they wanted to, could have claimed that it was outright military conflict between their military and the Western militaries, but it has been going on all the time. Now, that is not inconsistent, however, with the kind of proxy conflicts that have taken place during the Cold War. But then, last year, the line was finally crossed. The United States and Britain began to carry out missile strikes on Russian territory, internationally recognized Russian territory that they themselves recognize as part of Russia. Obviously, these missile strikes are represented as being carried out by Ukraine, but the Russians have repeatedly made the point that these missile strikes cannot take place without the active involvement of American and British technicians. No one I'm aware of has come forward and said that that is not true. In fact, I have read articles in the mainstream media in the West, including the Daily Telegraph, which admits that it is true. So the United States and Britain have both been involved in carrying out strikes, missile strikes, on Russian territory. The Russians have pointed out that this was an act of war, and they're absolutely correct. Conducting military strikes against the territory of another country in that kind of way most emphatically is an act of war. And that is something completely different from anything we have seen in any conflict, any superpower conflict that has taken place previously. During the Cold War, there were many proxy conflicts between the Americans and the Russians, but at no point in time did they conduct strikes on each other's territory, or if they did, they were very careful indeed to keep the facts secret, so that even to this day, we know scarcely anything about it. I say that because I have heard some stories that some things did take place in the 1980s, that some people did cross from Afghanistan into the Soviet Union, for example. I'm not sure that I believe those stories, but anyway, the point remains that if it was done, both sides made it their business to make sure that the world didn't know, because of course it was understood to be an act of war. Well, this time it was different. The United States and Britain both participated in actual missile strikes on Russian territory, and those missile strikes were conducted in public, in the most public way. I will just quickly add that, of course, we also have a leaked transcript of telephone conversations amongst German generals, in which they also straightforwardly acknowledge that missile strikes of this kind can only take place through the direct involvement of Western military personnel, and they also acknowledge that the British were already involved in working and assisting the Ukrainians to conduct these strikes. So that was an act of war. Other things have been done which are also consistent with countries being at war with each other. To give an example, Russia's assets, the assets of its central bank, have been frozen. Well, that in itself is not perhaps necessarily an act of war, but as has been pointed out by articles in the Financial Times, actually seizing those assets, confiscating them, would be an act of war, or at least it has always been so perceived to be in the past. And in fact, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that after a lot of hesitation and debate and discussion, both the Americans and the Europeans over the last few weeks have taken the further step of providing Ukraine with loans, the United States with a $20 billion loan, the European Union today with a €3 billion loan, both of which supposedly are going to be paid for from the interest accruing from the Russian frozen assets. Now, again, some people have tried to create legal distinctions between the interest and the principal of the assets. They say that though the assets themselves are somehow Russian property and should not be confiscated, the interest in some way must be treated differently. I am at a complete loss to understand the legal reasoning here. I doubt that it would survive very long in any impartial court, but there it is. The step's been done. And of course, the most public confiscation of assets has been the seizure of Russia's central bank reserves, the freezing of the central bank reserves. But of course, there have been lots of other assets that have been seized and frozen as well. Assets of various Russian businessmen, Russian companies, Gazprom's entire energy infrastructure in Germany, the underground gas reserves that it ran there, for example, they've effectively been seized as well. And well, there we are. And on top of that, we've also had direct attacks on Russian physical infrastructure outside the war zone. Now, here we come back to the vexed story of the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. We've still not been given a remotely satisfactory account of who exactly was responsible for this. All of the Western countries that were supposed to be involved in investigations of this attack, the Germans, the Swedes, the Finns, the Danes, all of them have made sure that we're not really given full access to the truth. The Russians have been completely frozen out of the investigations, even though the attack took place against their property in what I understand are international waters. Now, putting aside who did carry out that attack, whether it was the United States, as Seymour Hersh, the American reporter, claims, or the Ukrainians, as the Germans say, and has been floated in various articles in the United States, the 6 guys and a boat hypothesis. There's no question at all that that was an act of war. And again, the Western powers have looked the other way as it has happened. Indeed, they have covered up for it. And of course, all of this is consistent, as I said, with two parties being, in effect, at war with each other. And not only is that the case, but we've even had even more dramatic suggestions. We've had repeated suggestions from President Macron that troops should be sent to Ukraine, nominally as peacekeepers, but as I've discussed in many programs, the numbers of troops involved, 40,000, 100,000, 150,000, are not consistent with a peacekeeping force of any kind They are obviously and clearly war-fighting forces. And of course, you only send forces to fight if you're actually at war with someone. Anyway, we've had those ideas and those suggestions. And, well, we've had all kinds of other suggestions as well. And I'm not even going to discuss the sabotage and assassination operations that have taken place. In a recent program, I discussed how a series of meetings in April in the United States involving think tanks and decision makers, which we were informed about by the US media, there were straightforward admissions there that militarily speaking the war was lost, but some kind of asymmetric struggle supposedly should take its place. And this also was discussed in the United States, and it also went ahead and went forward, and that too, in a sense, is consistent with an act of war. So we've had this whole series of actions consistent with with a state of war between the United States and Russia, between the Western powers and Russia. But all of this incessantly accompanied by denials that this is the situation. Whenever any kind of escalation takes place, the Western powers come forward and insist that they're not actually at war with Russia. They're only taking limited steps in order to help Ukraine defend itself from what they say is Russian aggression. Many of the steps the Western powers have taken, as I have said, are consistent with or are acknowledged to be acts of war, but there is always this denial that they are in fact such. And of course, the complete refusal to engage the Russians in diplomatic discussions is consistent with an act of war, with a state of war. When countries are at war with each other, they don't usually communicate directly with each other, though in practice and in fact, they often, as it happens, do. The Germans and the Allies, for example, on specific topics and on specific occasions, actually did do so during the Second World War. Just saying. Well, there we are. Now Trump comes along and he's going to throw all of that out of the window. He's going to speak to Putin. He wants a summit meeting with Putin. Putin wants a summit meeting with him. The ice finally is breaking. Trump has already taken a major step towards de-escalation simply by resuming dialogue with the Russians. And that is an important fact that is not to be underestimated. And there's going to be more contacts. Kellogg presumably will be traveling to Moscow at some point. He's been given 100 days in which to sort out some kind of peace. I've been thinking about this actually since I touched on it yesterday. It strikes me that there is a probable explanation to the timing. The Biden administration has run through, as far as it can, all the funding that was allocated to support Ukraine in the appropriation that was voted by Congress and signed off by Biden in April of last year. However, it said that there's $3.8 billion left. Now, I suspect it is going to be very difficult indeed for Trump to come to Congress and ask for a further appropriation for Ukraine. Difficult, though, of course, not impossible. It very much depends on how things turn out. But it's something that, at the moment, I don't think he wants or plans to do. But he still has $3.8 billion that he could use if he wanted to send arms to Ukraine. I'm going to make a guess that that would probably last, given the pace of the fighting. Well, the calculation probably is that that will probably last for about 100 days before more money is needed in order to keep the war going. And I suspect that's why Trump is telling Kellogg, you've got to sort this out in 100 days, because after those 100 days, we've got no more money to keep this war continuing, and perhaps it might be wise for you to explain this fact to the Ukrainians. Now, by the way, many people are now making comments about the fact that Trump is now saying that he doesn't expect the war to end on the first day that he becomes president. People are saying that that was never realistic, and I am one of those people. It was never realistic that there could be a negotiated resolution of the war in 24 hours. I mean, that, given the complexities of this war, of which Trump is showing an increasing degree of awareness, there was never any realistic possibility that this war could be brought to an end in 24 hours through a diplomatic process. I'm just going to add a point, though, which I don't think anyone else has made, which is that if Trump simply wanted the fighting to stop in 24 hours, he actually does have a tool which might make it possible for him to do that. And that is that he could speak to his friend, Elon Musk, who is now a semi-detached member, or will soon be a semi-detached member of the Trump administration in this Dodge agency that he's going to be running, along with Vivek Ramaswamy. And of course, Elon Musk could simply switch off Starlink, closing down the entire communications network upon which the Ukrainian military relies. Now, in conditions of pervasive Russian jamming, that would bring communications within the Ukrainian military to essentially not a complete stop, but anyway, it would reduce them drastically to the point, I suspect, where cohesion within the military would very rapidly break down, and making further sustained resistance impossible. Just saying. So, in theory, Trump could, maybe it wouldn't stop the fighting in 24 hours, but he could get his friend Elon Musk to press a switch, and certainly Ukraine's ability to keep fighting would come to a stop very rapidly. But I don't think, again, that Trump has ever really been serious about this. I don't think he's ever really imagined that he could end the war in 24 hours. And he's showing a realistic understanding now that this will require more time, and he wants to meet Putin, and he's given Kellogg 100 days. And that's, I think I've explained what I think the reason for that is. After the 100 days, the money will simply not be there. So we are going to see finally a breaking of the diplomatic ice. Does that mean that there is going to be a negotiated end to the war, or a peace settlement? Well, this has come at a desperately late point in this war, if I can say. Because had diplomatic contacts existed, had there been proper meetings and conversations between the US and Russian presidents and their officials over the last 3 years, had there been real efforts made to try and find a way towards peace, I think it's very likely that we would have had peace. After all, there was a draft agreement signed, or at least initialed, and almost sealed, agreed in Istanbul in April 2022. The Western powers could got behind all of that, and we could have had peace. Just saying. And if there'd been a real effort made to engage the Russians diplomatically, we could have had peace. But the Biden administration and its European allies decided otherwise. They didn't pursue a peaceful, negotiated outcome. They sought instead victory. They sought victory against Russia, one of the most difficult countries, perhaps the most difficult country to win a war against. As I've discussed in many places and many times, the one thing that the Russians have consistently shown that they are good at, it is winning wars. They don't always win every one of their wars, but it's the case that much more often than not, they tend to win them, even if they go about fighting those wars in ways that Westerners often have difficulties understanding, as Napoleon and the German generals previously discovered. But anyway, that was the plan. That was the intention. It was not to seek peace. It was to achieve victory. And instead of victory, because peace was not sought, what we have instead now is a situation where we are facing defeat, where the Russian army is breaking through. I'll come to all of that in a little while. They're breaking through on every part of the front lines, when the Ukrainians are stretched to breaking point, where they're finding it more and more difficult to hold positions, where they are suffering horrible losses, and they're finding it very difficult to keep things together. And of course, it is very, very difficult to negotiate with a side that is about to win when you are the side that is about to lose. And that brings me back to my previous point, that the West has acted over the last 3 years as if it was at war with Russia, even whilst repeatedly denying that it was. And when you act as if you are at war, in all practical terms, you are at war. And of course, you can only dictate terms if you are the winner. But if you are the loser in a war, even if it is an undeclared one, then obviously, if you want to negotiate an exit, you do so from a very much weaker position. And that's the position that the West is in today. It's important to understand this. It is not just Ukraine that is losing the war. The collective West is losing the war. It is the West that chose to wage it in this way. It is the West that sought victory, and it is the West, therefore, given the situation on the battlefield, is now facing defeat. So, what can be achieved? Well, we shall see. Even if the Russians are in a very strong position, which they are in, and even if the Russians have deep reasons to mistrust the West, and I've discussed this in many, many programs, in their own interests, they might have reason, nonetheless, to seek some kind of negotiated outcome which enables them to keep the most important things that they have won, but which also enables them to secure peace on their western borders, which they themselves have said is their greatest priority. A negotiated peace, from a Russian point of view, is a better outcome than a victory in order to achieve that, because a victory cannot be a total one. It can be a victory, a total victory can be achieved against Ukraine if the Russians want to achieve a total victory against Ukraine. Then they do have the ability to do it. They can achieve it. But a total victory over the collective West, a victory which would secure peace on Russia's borders, that is impossible. And the Russians understand that very well. So that does give some way, something for the Americans and for the Russians to talk about. And it could be, and perhaps it will be, that coming out of those negotiations and whatever agreement is eventually reached, and I'm not in any way exaggerating the prospects of that. In fact, if anything, I would say that I'm pessimistic about the prospects of that. But it could be that out of that negotiation, depending on the final outcome, some kind of Ukrainian state might be preserved. Just saying. But anyway, we will see what is to come. So, summit meeting between Putin and Trump, possible summit meeting involving not just Putin and Trump, but Xi Jinping. I assume that will be a separate summit meeting, a later summit meeting, if it does take place. And of course, there will undoubtedly be summit meetings between Trump and Xi. Biden has met and spoken to Xi many times. There is no reason why Trump and Xi should not speak with each other. And that, I suspect, is what the two of them are going to do. But, to repeat again, if we do have a three-party summit, the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, represented by their presidents, then that will be a meeting of the world's three great powers. And the Europeans, who have become very accustomed to thinking of themselves as part of a joint enterprise with the Americans, the collective West, won't like that at all. They will feel deeply resentful and angry about the fact that they have been left out. Now, that brings me to another point, which is meeting between the three leaders, China, the leaders of China, Russia, and America, perhaps to discuss spheres of influence based on my various discussions in my most recent programs about Trump's demands with respect to Canada, Greenland, Mexico, and Panama. Well, that could very well be what it is all about. But I ought to say that the Russian media have now been floating another theory about all of these statements, which incidentally is not actually incompatible with what I've talked about previously, the quest for spheres of influence, the idea of a return to spheres of influence. But what the Russians are saying, and interestingly enough, they're now citing an article in the Argentine media, which basically says exactly the same. They're saying that all of these statements from Trump are America's way of reconciling itself, of adjusting to the fact that it is about to be defeated in Ukraine. Now, I've said already that if you commit yourself to a war, even if you pretend that you're not actually at war, but if you are in fact in reality in a kind of a war, and you declare, you announce the fact, you commit yourself to achieving a victory in that war. If the war fails, then it is a defeat. And in this war, not just a defeat for Ukraine, but a defeat for the West, which sought and pursued the war and aimed to achieve victory against Russia. And of course, since the leader of the West is the United States, it is a defeat also for the United States. And I would suggest it is the biggest defeat in international terms that the United States has ever suffered. It's a far bigger defeat, potentially, than the defeat that the United States experienced in Vietnam. Now, I say that, and of course one must qualify this, because the US military was not directly engaged in fighting the Russians in Ukraine in the way that the US military was engaged in fighting the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese in Vietnam. So it is not a military defeat in that sense, but it is certainly a huge geostrategic defeat. It is one which reverses, to a great extent, the glow of victory that the United States gave itself at the end of the Cold War. It means that the Russians have re-established themselves as a major equivalent great power in Europe, where the United States in the 1990s assumed that it had won the struggle for the mastery in Europe, to cite an old phrase. It has now discovered that it has not achieved that outcome. After all, the Russians are back, and they're back in force, and they have inflicted a defeat on the United States. Now, Europe, for all its problems, remains a far more important part of the world geopolitically than Indochina was in the 1960s. So it is a major defeat for the United States. It is a defeat which confirms that the unipolar moment is over, that the period of unchallenged US dominance, which actually didn't last very long, has now ended. And it's not surprising, it would not be surprising, if in this kind of situation, some people in the United States were saying, well, we've maybe suffered this defeat, or reverse, let's nonetheless tell ourselves, reassure ourselves that we are still strong. Let's show to the world that we are still strong. Let's go ahead and threaten Canada and Denmark and Panama and Mexico, or much weaker powers than ourselves. Denmark maintains an army in Greenland that is said to number all of 75 men, just saying. And the Danish army, I believe, numbers around 16,000 men, not army, armed forces. And of course, Denmark has given most of its heavy equipment to Ukraine, so it's desperately short of that too, and it's given a large number of its F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. So, of course, it's in no position to fight the United States. If the United States does decide to occupy Greenland militarily, there would be no resistance because Denmark is in no position to offer resistance. Just saying. And, well, of course, Canada and Mexico, different situation completely. But neither of these countries, certainly not even Canada, would be able to withstand a prolonged war with the United States. Not that anybody seriously is talking about that. And frankly, I think a military operation by the United States against Canada or Mexico would be a complicated operation. Both of these countries do have militaries, real militaries. And, well, I'm not going to explore that. It's all too fantastic to take seriously. So, anyway, I could see that there might be some merit in this, that this is all a kind of cope, an attempt by America to say to itself, well, despite the fact that we've suffered this big reverse, nonetheless, we're still strong. But I think one can take this too far. Firstly, I don't think Donald Trump himself fully thinks that. He was always interested in Greenland. He was talking about Greenland long before this conflict began. He was talking about Greenland even during his first term. And I don't think that he feels any ownership or responsibility for what has gone wrong in Ukraine. As he rightly says, he had no part in any of it. I don't think that Donald Trump or those who are advising him themselves feel that they're any sort of losers in this matter, or that the United States really is. I think that they think that this whole debacle is entirely the work of the Biden administration, and that they own it, is the worst administration, as they would say, that the United States has had since the Second World War. By the way, I would agree with that view. And what has happened is a defeat for the administration rather than for the United States. Anyway, I nonetheless float that because it is a view that is starting to gain quite a lot of traction inside Russia. Even the TASS news agency is debating it, as I noticed earlier today. So there we are. Meetings, negotiations, but of course the war grinds on. The Russians continue to push forward. There's been more reports this morning of fighting in the Kursk region. I am not going to go into the details. I don't think there's any actual value in doing that now. All I would say is that one village after another, Alexandria, Berdino, probably Malaya Loknia, they're all tumbling into Russian control. Makhnova, just south of Suja. At the Ramstein meeting, which has just taken place, the very last one probably of these meetings, in Germany, Zelensky, of course, turned up with his officials. He still went on talking about how the Kursk offensive was an extraordinary, brilliant success, a victory by the Ukrainian army. I think the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, who are being smashed and who are being reduced to a small enclave around Suja itself, if they were asked what they think about these things that Zelensky has been saying about the brilliant success of the Suja operation. I'm guessing that most of them would say things that would be unprintable. Anyway, it has proved to be a complete disaster. Now, the Russians are also saying that they have cut off all of the supply routes to the Ukrainian garrison, holding the major fortified areas in Chasiv Yar. The Russians played all the usual games over the last couple of weeks. They advanced into the main fortified position that the Ukrainians had, which is the industrial area, the refractory plant. That forced the Ukrainians to send forces to try to recapture the refractory plant. The Russians then pulled back. They took advantage of the Ukrainian redeployments to hold the refractory plant, to occupy all sorts of other areas. That then enabled them to cut the communications to the entire Ukrainian grouping in Chasiv Yar. There's a long report about it in Redovka, and I suspect that that is true. The Russians have enlarged their two bridgeheads across the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. There are some reports that they are now moving towards another village in this area west of the Zherebets river, from their place called Ivanivka. This is the village of Kolodyazy. The Russians capture Kolodyazy. They are within a very short distance of Liman. And of course, if the Russians also, as has been reported, managed to consolidate control of the village of Torske, east of the Zherebets river, but also very close to Liman, then an attack on Liman suddenly begins to look like a very real possibility. And in Toretsk, we now have film from the Ukrainians which confirm the point that I made yesterday, that the Russians are now operating in the fields. Russian troops are present in the fields north of Liman, north of Toretsk. In other words, the Russians have Toretsk behind them. It's quite likely that there are still Ukrainian troops holding out in a few places inside Toretsk. But in military terms, Toretsk has fallen, and the Russians have cut the road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, as I discussed yesterday. The Russians have apparently captured more villages south of Pokrovsk as they continue the process of encircling Pokrovsk. The Russians are apparently now systematically bombing Velikaya Novosilka, all clear telltale signs that a Russian offensive, a Russian assault on Velikaya Novosilka is coming. So the pattern of the war continues as before. The commentator known as Big Serge, by the way, has written another one of his huge, magnificent overviews of the conflict. You can find it on his Substack blog. As is often the case, there are a few details that I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm not going to waste time dwelling on those. Big Serge's overall point is that the Russians are close to winning the war of attrition, that 2024 saw an actual collapse of Ukrainian defenses in southwest Donbass, that the Ukrainian military is now becoming increasingly exhausted and short of men and machines, and that if 2024 for the Ukrainians was bad, there's every reason to think that 2025 is going to be much worse. And, well, he also mentions that after the surge in military supplies from the West in 2023, despite loud claims to the contrary, military aid to Ukraine in 2024 began to dwindle. And I mentioned that there's been a meeting of the Ramstein group. This is the group of Western countries that assembles at the Ramstein air base in Germany, where the various decisions to send supplies to Ukraine are made. And this is the last such meeting to happen under the aegis of the Biden administration. Lloyd Austin was present. All the various defense ministers of the NATO countries were also present. But the reports say that Zelensky came away deeply dissatisfied from the meeting. He made speeches, he made comments saying that the point had now been reached. The best thing that the West could do now was to send combat troops to fight the Russians in Ukraine. If he really believes or believed in advance of that meeting that meeting would sign off that proposal, then he is absolutely delusional. I can't believe that even Zelensky seriously imagines this. But anyway, he came, he made that demand. Obviously, none of the NATO states committed themselves to doing that. And the promises of arms supplies that were made, I'm sure he will find disappointing. The Germans say they would provide 50 more missiles for the IRIS-T system. Interestingly, again, these are coming from German stockpiles. In other words, these are missiles that have been ordered for the Bundeswehr, that they're going to be sent to Ukraine instead, reducing the Bundeswehr's capabilities still more. But 50 missiles in the Ukrainian conflict is nothing. As Brian Beletic has repeatedly pointed out, if you're going to try and shoot down a Russian cruise missile, you would normally launch 2 air defense missiles at the target, assuming that there was 100% success with the IRIS-T system, which of course there isn't. That means that 50 more IRIS-T missiles are going to shoot down 25 Russian cruise missiles. And the Russians have been launching cruise missiles against Ukraine in the number of tens of thousands. The Ukrainians say that they have 1,500 ready for use in their stockpiles. So this is nothing. And the Germans have also committed to providing Ukraine with some more old Yugoslav tanks, refurbished T-72s or something of that kind. None of this is going to change the outcome of the war in Ukraine, or can do so. In fact, the whole Ramstein meeting was a sad end to this process. I remember the euphoria at the Ramstein meeting in the winter of 2022, 2023, early 2023, when everybody was coming along, pledging to supply their heavy weapons, their tanks, their armoured vehicles. Brigades were going to be set up with all of these things, all in preparation for Ukraine's great summer offensive, which of course failed disastrously. This time, nobody really has any enthusiasm in this. nobody seriously expects that this is going to change anything, and nobody seriously is proposing to make any big commitments. They can all see the trajectory of travel in the war, and besides, they're also waiting for Donald Trump. And I understand that the German cabinet, Olaf Scholz, has vetoed a proposal for a further donation of 3 billion euros of aid to Ukraine. Apparently, Annalena Baerbock and Boris Pistorius, Germany's foreign and defense ministers, lobbied for it. But the SPD, the dominant party in the outgoing coalition, was not happy. They understand that this would not go down at all well with their voters, and they said no. So there it is. So a meeting, a Ramstein meeting, which is fading away. So there we are. That's the reality of the war. Everybody now waits for Donald Trump. Meanwhile, critics of the war in Europe are becoming more active. Both Orban and Fico are publishing very strong statements complaining about Ukraine's decision to stop supplies of Russian gas across Ukraine using the Ukrainian pipeline system. Orban and Fico are saying that this is inconsistent with various undertakings previously given by Ukraine and the policies of the European Union. They're very unhappy that the European authorities, that the European Commission has not supported more strongly the EU states that are affected by this. And in Fico's case, he's again saying that Slovakia will cut back its exports of electricity to Ukraine and will veto any further financial assistance by the EU to Ukraine, the provision of any further financial assistance to Ukraine. And presumably in that he would have the backing of Orban. Now, the EU up to now has managed to circumvent objections from Slovakia and Hungary, but the Slovaks and the Hungarians are likely to be reinforced before long, because the attempt in Austria to exclude the Freedom Party from the coalition, that the governmental coalition that is now forming following the recent elections in Austria, that attempt has failed due to arguments between the OVP, the Conservative Party in Austria, and some of the coalition partners it was trying to work with. And the assumption now is that we're going to get a coalition led by Mr. Kikel. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, the leader of the Freedom Party. He will become Chancellor. I believe he will be the first member of the Freedom Party to be Chancellor of Austria. And this will be a new government led by the Freedom Party, with the Conservatives this time as the junior coalition partner. And there's even some reports that the former Conservative leader, Sebastian Kurz, who led a coalition which previously included the Freedom Party, that he might be returning to active politics and might be playing a role in this coalition. Well, we will see. I should say that there is an awful lot of misunderstanding about the Freedom Party and its history. I don't intend to get diverted into a long discussion of that in this program. What I would say is that the Freedom Party was a very middle-of-the-road party for most of its history, at least most of its post-war history. It gave tacit support, for example, to the socialist Chancellor Bruno Kreisky in the 70s and 80s, as I sort of remember. It only took a turn to the right in the late 1980s, when it was led by its former leader, Jörg Haider. But anyway, today, the key thing to say about the Freedom Party is that its stance on the conflict in Ukraine is essentially the same as that of the Hungarians and the Slovaks. It opposes further military assistance to Ukraine. It expresses open skepticism about the whole sanctions policy. It says that it is a huge mistake. It supports moves towards ending the war and establishing a ceasefire. It is, in other words, deeply critical of the whole Western policy line on Ukraine. The former empire of the Habsburgs, Austria-Hungary, is gradually being reconstructed along this precise issue. The Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Slovaks are now openly opposed to the European Commission's line, and it's widely believed that following elections in the Czech Republic, they will be joined by the Czechs as well. So, and by the way, just to say, in Croatia, another member state of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, the president, who is also an open skeptic about the war, has been re-elected, though in Croatia, it's the government that determines policy, and it is appointed not by the president, or at least it depends for its support on the parliament. Croatia is not a presidential republic. So anyway, there is now growing dissent within the European Union as well. And of course the dissenters, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Austrians, before long the Czechs, and some people in Croatia as well, they of course can make common cause with Trump and his people as well. Now, there's been an article in the Financial Times today talking about the growing alarm within the European Union about the fact that Donald Trump might be preparing to reverse unilaterally many of the sanctions that the Biden administration imposed. And it's an odd sort of article, but it says that the Americans, that Trump, actually does have the power to simply reverse many of these sanctions that Biden imposed by executive order, simply by revoking the executive orders. He doesn't need to go back to Congress in order to do that. Now, of course, he could in theory have done that in his first term, but there were many people who were afraid that he would. He didn't do so because, of course, he was immersed at that time in the Russiagate crisis, if I can call it that. And Congress passed an extraordinary law, I can't remember the exact title, Combating America's Enemies Act or whatever, which appeared to have been set up in order to prevent Trump from revoking the Obama-era sanctions on Russia. I made clear at the time that I was deeply skeptical about the constitutionality of this act, though I'm not an American constitutional lawyer. And Trump, when he signed the relevant law, appended to his signature various caveats in which he also made it clear that he basically didn't think that the law was constitutional either. But he couldn't really go against it at that time because he'd only been recently elected. He was the target of the Russiagate investigation. His political position was extremely fragile. And had he gone against the act and published an executive order cancelling the Obama-era sanctions, he would very likely have faced impeachment proceedings brought against him by a hostile Congress. That isn't the case today. Not only is Trump in an immeasurably stronger political position, he won the popular vote in the election. There's no suggestion this time that he did it with any kind of assistance from the Russians. But the House of Representatives would undoubtedly balk at publishing articles of impeachment against him. It is, after all, not only got a Republican majority, but it is a pro-Trump Republican majority. And I cannot imagine if such an impossible thing were ever to happen, that the Senate would approve such an impeachment either. Even if Trump has opponents in the Senate within the Republican Party, again, I think it is all but impossible that most Republican senators would support an impeachment of this kind. Now, I don't myself think that Trump is immediately going to cancel the sanctions, even though it's interesting that the European Commission apparently fears that he might. But I would give him one piece of unsolicited advice. Apparently, he wants to reduce energy costs in America even more. He's looking to do that by increasing energy production, oil and gas production in the United States. Perhaps he can, but as two articles in the Financial Times have said, that is going to take time, and it might be that for geological reasons, that might not even be fully possible. What Trump can do if he wants to bring down energy prices is that he can keep some of the Biden-era sanctions in place, but he can revoke the sanctions on Russian energy exports, oil and gas exports. And the United States does not, as it happens, need to import oil from Russia to any significant degree. And of course, it doesn't import LNG from Russia. But if the United States cancels its sanctions against Russian energy products, that will nonetheless have an effect on global energy prices. Now, it's likely, given the realities, that the Europeans, for the moment, will want to stick to their sanctions against these energy products. And Europe, obviously, historically has been a much bigger importer, in fact, a vastly bigger importer of Russian oil and gas than the United States has been. But if we're talking about international traders, people who deal in oil and gas products, the sanctions that worry them are not the sanctions the European Union imposes. It is the sanctions the United States imposes, in particular the secondary sanctions. And as somebody who has some knowledge of this kind of thing, some experience in this kind of thing, I will say that it is this issue that is complicating trade in oil, because dealers, brokers, shippers, when they transport oil, they always now have to worry that if it turns out that that oil is Russian or that LNG is Russian, if it has some point of origin, well, they might face penalties because they are perhaps breaching sanctions, even if they don't actually directly know what the origin of that oil is. It might have been laundered through all kinds of different middlemen and other things. And that, of course, inevitably will increase their costs, their premiums on their insurance policies and their legal costs and all that kind of thing. And inevitably, when you have this kind of setup and when there's multiple middlemen operating the system and arranging for this shipping to take place, well, that also is going to put an upward push on prices. Now, doing away with all of these sanctions, it's not going to change demand dynamics. It's not going to change production dynamics either. It's not going to fundamentally change the energy market. As we have seen, Russian oil and gas continues to have customers. In fact, the European Union is now stepping up imports of Russian LNG because their gas reserves are falling fast, because winter this year is proving to be very cold in Europe, and there is now a general shortage of gas, and gas prices are growing, just saying. So it's not going to fundamentally change the dynamics. And if you simplify things, if you make trading in oil and gas easier and simpler and smoother again, then that will mean the prices are going to be lower than they would otherwise be, and it will be a big enough difference, almost certainly, to work its way through into global energy prices, including those in the United States itself. Just saying. So this would be a good anti-inflation measure. And if Trump does this, he can absolutely, validly, and correctly argue that the energy sanctions in Russia have failed. They've not significantly dented Russian exports of oil and gas. They merely redirected them to the east. The Russians still have a steady income stream from their exports. It has not suffocated the Russian economy or created a budgetary crisis or done any of the various things that people said it would. And it hasn't given the United States leverage over the Russians. The only party it has given leverage to over the Russians, arguably, is China, which has now become the customer for all of this redirected Russian gas, or at least pipeline gas, and which has become a major importer of Russian oil, and arguably India too. So why should the Americans give leverage to China and keep the price of energy in the United States higher than it would otherwise be, causing inflation also to be otherwise higher than it would otherwise be, when these sanctions are obviously not achieving their intended purpose. So if Trump wants to press ahead and revoke some sanctions, he could do that. He could do that in advance of his meeting with Putin. He might take some further steps. He might also allow Russian airlines to travel to the United States again. Just a small thing. Would not make any very great difference, but it would undoubtedly improve the general atmosphere. And it would not give anything fundamental away. Of course, the Europeans would be furious. There would be growing pressure in Europe from Orban, Fico, before long Kikel and others, also to do away with the energy sanctions. Quite possibly some people in Germany would say that the time had therefore come to reopen Nord Stream, the one Nord Stream pipeline that supposedly remains undamaged. But it would taking this step would actually help the United States, and it would ease the process with the Russians. If I have to be frank, if anybody in Washington worries that the Russians would return to their old energy relationship with Germany and with the EU, the one that worried people, including Trump, previously so much, all I would say is that that will never come back because the Russians don't want it to. As far as they're concerned, they found reliable customers in Asia. They're not going to risk it by restarting a trade with Europe that has brought them nothing but grief. So anyway, there it is. This is where I'm going to finish today's program. There's an awful lot more going on. There's some very strange tensions starting to appear between Trump and Netanyahu, or at least so they look to me. It looks as if things are not completely well with that relationship. But I'm going to return to that topic in my next program. So, lots of things in play. The important thing to understand is that the war, essentially, from the Russian side has been won. Ukraine, Biden administration, the neocons, the Europeans have lost. That is what is driving events, and it's now going to be left to Trump to do what he can to pick up the pieces. Well, more from me tomorrow. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.